They say that when the stars align, a man will come to the internet and review video games. Well, this time, they're probably only right out of coincidence. Welcome to the 1 Minute Rundown. I'm OC Trinity, your host, but you can call me Stoltheim Reinbach III. This time, we're running down Suikoden. Probably one of the better JRPG series you've never heard of, and one with a few common gameplay mechanics that set aside from the competition, in particular its huge cast of characters, commonly known as the 108 Stars of Destiny. Usually early in each game, you'll start building up your own castle and recruit them. Collect them all! Some characters join your active party as per RPG tradition, while others open up shops and services at your home base. Magic is based on runes, which may provide a small selection of magic or some other support skill. One battle system isn't enough for this game. You'll also see a special system for one-on-one duels and full-scale army versus army battles. This episode will cover all 5 main series games plus 2 spin-offs. Let's find out whether or not this less mainstream series is worth your attention. The first game in the series feels a bit short and simple compared to the rest of the series, but it also proves that short and simple aren't necessarily bad. There's not too much in the way of early installment weirdness. We still have 108 recruitable characters, most of which manage to be useful in some way or another, and several of which have team attacks when put in the same party. Sure, some of the characters end up getting forced into your party, but if you've got a team this big, it makes sense to get them involved somehow. One-on-one and major battles are still here, but one-on-one's only used 3 times in the whole game, and army versus army is really just a slightly expanded rock-paper-scissors game, so they're not exactly strong points. Unlike the rest of the series, characters can only equip 1 rune, but this isn't necessarily a negative point, just another element of strategy. And this being a JRPG, I guess I need to bring up story, so while this one doesn't throw any huge surprises out there, it sets up an interesting world and characters. So in the end, we get a game that doesn't throw out too many design surprises beyond the huge cast size and rune system, but it knows what it wants to be, and it does it very well. Most JRPGs have a way of reinventing themselves after each sequel, but this one seemed to think all it needed to do was provide a fresh new plot and some tweaks to the formula. And let me tell you, it pulls it off spectacularly. The only huge change was to the large-scale battles, which are now using a more tactics-based system where movement matters. The game takes place 3 years in one country away from the first game, so expect to see some familiar characters and locales. Characters expand from equipping 1 rune to 3, but frequently not getting all 3 all at once. Side material has a lot more variety, especially in extra stuff available at your home base, and we've got a much more interesting story, complete with some amazing villains, expanding on some of the material presented in the first game, and presenting more than enough unexpected twists to keep things moving. Even the team attacks from putting characters with pre-established relationships in the same party have more variety. You'll notice I'm late into the minute here and really haven't brought up anything negative, and that's because I really can't think of much. I'll go so far as to say this is the best JRPG out there on the PS1, and that's saying a lot. This game uses an interesting plot device and plays out the story from 3 different perspectives, and frequently you'll get different viewpoints on the same events, and the idea of playing so many characters is pretty cool. From a gameplay perspective, there's one great new addition in the form of a skill system, where characters can learn and level up different skills to provide support abilities or power up different attributes, and it does a lot to give each character more advantages and disadvantages. The battle system changes are a mixed bag. Having one character in a supportive role that provides non-combat bonuses is good. Rather than a traditional 6-man party, it's closer to giving commands in 3 sets of 2, which makes giving special commands difficult. Magic is harder to use effectively since most spells have charge time that can be interrupted. Having faster characters able to attack twice in a turn if they're fast and close enough is cool, but the point before makes battles favor fighters over mages. Duels are improved to what I think is the series peak with the simple addition of an advantage meter. Large-scale battles feel like they're just built off a limited version of the main battle system, but interesting enough. So overall, not quite as good as the PS1 games, but still worth a look. I heard this was intended to be a throwback to the first game, at least as far as keeping the short and simple idea, and to put it bluntly, it didn't work. I'll go so far as to say parts of this look like they were designed for something different before being shoehorned into the Suikoden series. Battles are scaled down from 6 combatants to 4, and combined with how late into the game you get most of the cast and that you can't tell if characters even have a team attack together until keeping them in the same party for a while, it makes having so many characters feel fairly useless. As what I assume was a compromise to that, you can switch your party mid-combat while on the overworld, but there's only a handful of places where that really helps. And speaking of the overworld, it's just a mostly empty ocean with an encounter rate too high to encourage lots of exploring. The skill system from the last game is gone, one-on-one fights are back to barely used, but admittedly the presentation on those has improved immensely. The large-scale battles are now naval combat and actually work pretty well except for one feature where one ship can board another. The characters fight using literally just basic attacks and the losing side immediately gets sunk. If you're interested in the Suikoden lore, you might get something out of this, but otherwise just stay away. You know, the obligatory tactics spin-off, where characters get one move and one action per turn, where your position and formation make a huge difference. Standard for this series, you get a huge cast size, the skill system from 3, and a lot of references to previous games, mostly from 4. What sets this one apart from the rest of the series, and the turn-based strategy genre as a whole, is an elemental system where each panel of the map can have a different element, and your character's abilities increase or decrease depending on how their natural elemental affinity compares to the element they're standing on. It's well thought out, but there are a few issues with it. The difference in power is so drastic that a character on the strong element attacking a character on the weak element is frequently an instant kill, and considering your characters can be killed off permanently, that's kind of a big deal. Dedicated magic users, the only ones that can use the traditional spell runes, are a bit rare as well, but seeing as weapon runes use MP now, it's a reasonable trade-off. The game certainly delivers in terms of side material by offering a lot of extra quests and adds a bit of closure to the story of Suikoden 4 if you actually endured playing it. It's a pretty seamless transition to the tactics genre, and worth checking out if you're into these kinds of games. Here's an interesting case of good ideas but bad execution. It's clear Konami wanted to address the complaints from 4, and as such we've got the skill system from 3 returning, as well as a much longer adventure with a strong storyline, focuses mostly on 2 warring noble families that go too far to move the country towards their extremes. Your traveling party is now up to 10 characters, 6 actively fighting and 4 that can be used for either support bonuses or for a mid-fight substitution. And again, army versus army changed, this time to a pretty cool real-time strategy minigame. So what goes wrong here? Well, once again, the character's not exactly the kindest towards using all these characters. When one joins, and expect that to take far more effort than any of the games up to this point, they start with no skill points and a level 1 weapon, making it a bit hard to tell if they'll be worth using in the end. So you're a bit shoehorned into using characters that you've been using for a while, or at least the plot-mandated ones. And as much as I'll praise the story, it takes a long time for it to really get going. We've got about 4 hours worth of exposition and setup before the game goes into high gear. So no, this doesn't get near the level of quality of the earlier games, but it's still worth playing. I usually make it a rule to have finished my games before reviewing them, and find it necessary to bring up that this review isn't based on a complete playthrough, but that's because, yeah, I got several hours in and couldn't find any reason to keep going. Unlike the games to this point, this was in a separate parallel world where the characters suddenly become aware of other parallel worlds. The concept is interesting enough, though not exactly paced all that well. But it's the gameplay where things really fall apart. In fact, aside from having 108 characters, it really doesn't resemble the old games much. See, one cool concept is that each character learns a small variety of spells but can swap them with other characters, which would be cool if magic was consistently useful, and most of the time you're okay just using basic attacks. Your traveling party is back down to 4 members, and it probably doesn't even matter which 4 you pick because the game's painfully easy, so much that you could put an incomplete party of characters well below the expected level and still turn out okay. So in the end, battles are just matching regular attack and waiting for results, and that gave no sign of changing. So easy, really, the entire game just felt boring. If this game eventually became any good, it was well after I gave up on it. That's all for Suikoden. The games I talked about make up the entirety of games translated to English, but there's more that hasn't left Japan. There's Suikoden Card Stories, a collectible card game spin-off, Suikoden, a visual novel series, and The Woven Web of a Century, a more traditional game in the series. Of these, only the last one's likely to get localized since it was released fairly recently. Even then, though, Konami seems fairly good about getting a new game in the series out every few years, changing the fans' outcry to one more along the lines of when are you going to go back to the original continuity. Needless to say, I'm hoping the answer sooner rather than later. If this review is encouraging you to pick up games from this series, I'm afraid I have both good and bad news. The first game is downloadable on PSN, and the PS2 games I was able to find often enough on the used game racks at GameStop often enough that I don't think they're that hard to come by. But if you're looking for Suikoden 2, expect to pay upwards of $100 for it. And check back in 2 weeks for the next episode of 1 Minute Rundown. This time we did loads and loads of characters. Next we'll do part of a series with loads and loads of games. Also, I promise this time it's a series you've actually heard of. See you then, and remember, even at his most powerless, man's existence is never without meaning. Well, you're telling me this Joltheim Reinbach III actually exists? And he looks and acts like that? You know what? No, this game has gotten even worse. You have one chance to redeem yourself. One.
So you decided to just abandon your ship? I know, but my arm wouldn't move, don't you understand?
Okay, fine. After reviewing, the score stands.